All right, welcome to lesson number 4 on the history of idolatry. So in lesson number 1, we talked about why men turned away from Yahweh to idols, to create their own religion. All of this is from a biblical perspective. And I believe that Moses in the book of Genesis has given us certain hints as to when and why all this happened. So in lesson number 2, we talked about why. Why did men find that serving Yahweh so objectionable that they turned to their own religion and created their own gods? And then lesson number 3, we talked about how. How did they form these gods? Where did they come from? And I find all 3 of those lessons some incredible information that I think it's important for Christians to know, because idolatry is alive and well today. And we talked about in lesson 1 that it is a little more difficult to talk about modern day idolatry because it is a little bit different. Our idols today are what we would call morally neutral. In themselves, they're not good or bad, but it's how we use them. It's what they mean to us. When they become the source of all of our time and energy and devotion, especially when we start thinking of them as sacred, then they become a god. They become an idol for us. So in this lesson, we're going to talk about the pagans and the flood. The flood is a key story in this series of lessons, because I believe that from the flood onward, Moses is kind of telling us when all this fell apart. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. But here's the question. We've got this story, this important story in the Bible about Noah and the flood. But it's not the only story in existence from ancient time about a catastrophe, a deluge, this incredible flood that destroyed the living beings on the earth. The pagans wrote about their gods, and as they wrote about their gods, there is this story about the flood. Why did pagans write about a flood? Well, that's what we're going to talk about in this lesson. And so let's start with our premise here. I believe that as we start with the flood, of course, as we bring our timeline out, God starts all over with Noah and his family, tells them to be fruitful and multiply. And no doubt, Noah not only worshiped God, but teaches his descendants, his sons, his great-grandsons, and so forth, about Yahweh, about why the flood came, about all that happened before the flood recorded in the book of Genesis. He wants his family to what? He wants his family to worship God so that this flood won't come again. There won't be a judgment like that. And so the next big story that's told in the book of Genesis is the Tower of Babel. And what happens, you see this great transition from Noah, this faithful man of God, blameless, walking with God, to people that are trying to make a name for themselves. And so what does God do? Well, the Tower of Babel, as we talked about through the genealogies of chapter 10, Genesis chapter 10, if it's all put together, it's about 100 years after the time of the flood. And so God is not happy with the Tower of Babel. He is not happy with men and what they're doing. And so what does he do? He confuses their languages and he scatters the people. And so what we have eventually, the forming of these different peoples, these different nations. They're all the same, but they're all different in that they reject Yahweh and they worship the idols. And that's exactly the picture that is painted in the book of Genesis, where men start to create their own gods. and start worshiping those gods and reject Yahweh. But here's an important premise in all of this. Where did all these pagan nations come from? Well, they all come tracing back to, if you will, the second Adam, Noah and his wife, his sons and his daughters-in-law. And no doubt they were told over and over about the flood, and they were told about these stories in the book of Genesis of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel. And even though they reject Yahweh, as they write about their gods, as they create their own stories about their idols, what happens? They don't forget what they taught in the past. And it becomes part of their religion. It becomes part of their stories of their gods. It becomes part of their idolatry. And so we're going to see where that is evidence when it comes to the flood. And so even though Noah's descendants turned away from God to idols, the knowledge and worship of Yahweh crept into their pagan religion. It's what they knew. It's what they grew up with. It's how they were taught growing up. Even though they rejected it, it didn't leave them. And that's what we're going to see in these next few lessons. An incredible evidence that even though they are idolaters and pagan, the Bible and God creeps into their newfound religion. And I think it's an incredible evidence about God and about the Bible that these stories are true. That even people that reject God still hold in some form and fashion to His existence. Whether intentional or non-intentional, it is there. So, let's talk about this. Now, as we talk about the origin of idolatry, we're using the Bible, we're using that as a timeline, as the facts of the evidence. But as we know, evolutionists would not accept my timeline, my premise, right? They reject the Bible. They say it's not historically accurate. And so as you look at what we're going to talk about, when we see the evidence for the flood, they're going to deny that. They're going to say there was no flood, or it wasn't like the flood story in the Bible. It was something different, something much less than what the Bible describes. And so, what would their timeline look like? And I think that's an important premise. And so let's talk a little bit about, from an evolutionary standpoint, here's a question. When did all this happen? And why? Why did these evolved creatures all of a sudden now become moral? And why did they become religious? And I really believe that evolutionists, though they have answers to these questions, they're not good answers. And they struggle with this. In fact, some would even deny that there really is morality. And given the theory of evolution, that's even more plausible than trying to come up with a reason why we are moral. The reality is that there really isn't any morality in evolutionary science. What one man thinks is right, the other man thinks is wrong. Who's to say is wrong? Because there's no standard. So let's talk a little bit about an evolutionary timeline. Right? We started with the flood. I believe that's where Moses is kind of leading us or starting us. But they don't have a flood story. And so what is their story? Well, their story is that we evolved. And so you start with a single cell organism, and then It evolves eventually into a multicell organism and then into different species, and one species goes to another species. But the idea is that these, for example, men, they don't just come from one group of apes, if you will. The apes are spread across the world. And so they evolve not from one group, but from scattered groups. I want you to think about that. And so you've got men evolving in one continent and then evolving into another continent. And that's why we have these differences. And so out of these groups come nations and culture and their own religion. And when you really look at it, it seems to me that there should be very little to no connection between these early descendants of man. They're already divided. They're already spread out as they're evolving. And so there's great distance between them. Now, why is that important to understand? Well, let's come back to that towards the end of our lesson. Let's talk a little bit about, all right, so here's our premise. And let's talk a little bit about the flood, okay? Here's the question. Did the flood actually happen? Many that don't believe in the Bible, atheists, critics of the Bible, would claim that it never, ever happened. But I want to tell you, the evidence for a worldwide catastrophe, the flood, there's incredible evidence. I believe the Grand Canyon is an incredible evidence. What is interesting and almost ironic is that evolutionary science makes a lot of use of the fossil record. But how are fossils formed? Fossils are formed, number one, by water. A lot of water, which kills animals quickly, and then they are what? Trapped and preserved in sedimentary rock. That all takes place underwater. Without water, there are no fossils. And so we got fossils all over the place. And there's an incredible evidence. How did these fossils come about? Well, the story of a flood in the world is a great answer to that. In addition to that, there's evidence of things like seashells located on the top of high elevated mountains. What are these seashells doing on the top of mountains? Well, evolutionists have an answer to that, but it's not a good answer. It's not as good as what the Bible gives. I want to tell you a story of one time. Took my family on one of those cave tours in Arizona. And a lot of what the cave guide was telling us was evolution, right? These stalagmites are millions of years old and so forth and so forth. But then we got to the inner recesses of the cave. And she said, you know, there's evidence that the state of Arizona was all underwater at one time. And she says, we don't know why. And my little son, who I think was about 6 or 7 at that time, comes up with a big smile and he says to me, Dad, I know why. It was the flood. And I just smiled. I was so proud of him. You know, that's the thing. There's all sorts of evidence in the world that a catastrophe like a worldwide flood happened. It's quite possible. But what? They don't want to open that door. They don't want to say that's possible or there's evidence for that because they know that opens up the door for the Bible being accurate and true. It's a lot like this refusal to let this discussion of an intelligent designer to enter into discussion of the origins of life. Why won't they? Because that is a very plausible conclusion or even theory in science, that there's something that's so complex, you have to say, well, there's some type of intelligence that designed this, that brought it into existence. But when it comes to the origins of life, they don't want to go there because they know you open that door, then you're opening up the door to God and to creation. And they refuse to do that. They're very much like the Pharisees, who would not even crack the door open that maybe Jesus was the Savior of the world. He was the Messiah. They refused to open that door. And so there's evidence out there, but they don't want us to know about it. They reject it because they will not open that door. And so they have to believe that even though there's evidence, we just don't know why. But one thing they're certain, it wasn't the worldwide flood like the Bible. Well, there are others that are going to tell you, well, yeah, there is evidence of flood, but they're going to tell you that it was really only a local flood. It wasn't worldwide. It was just a local flood. Much less than what the Bible describes. And sometimes they'll include Noah into that story. A lot of times they'll have many people surviving that local flood, not just one family. So I want to tell you that the evidence for the flood is incredible. But one of the pieces of evidence comes from these pagans who have rejected Yahweh, but Yahweh's in their past. And they all write about the flood. And our question would be, why? Well, let's talk a little bit about the flood and pagans. George Fraser says, flood stories are found on every continent except Antarctica, where no one lives. Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, the East Indies, Melanesia, Polynesia, South, Central, and North America. That's incredible. Why are these pagans writing about the flood? Derek Allen and J. Bernard Dallaire state that there are over 500 flood accounts. Now, some deny that. I've heard anything from the range of 200 flood accounts to 500. But imagine if we just say 200. 200 stories of a flood, and not just a local flood, of a worldwide catastrophe. That's incredible. That's incredible evidence. Now, the very common thing is this notion that even these pagans just kind of made up this story, and that the Bible, the writers of the Bible, copied that. Or that there was like a local flood and they wrote about that, but the Bible, well, it just kind of ran with it and made it very, much more grand. That's a very common view to explain the multiplicity of these stories. But isn't it possible that the Bible contains the story because it happened and was part of God's judgment upon the world? Could it be that these pagan nations wrote about the flood because it happened? And it was a story that was told to them, and it was such a big catastrophe that they talked about it quite often, and they wrote about it. It's kind of like Pearl Harbor, 9/11, any of the world wars. There's such big historical events that affect the people that are writing these stories, but affecting the whole world as well, that there's all sorts of stuff written about it. It's a part of history that doesn't get forgotten. So is it possible that all of these, whether it's 200 or 500, are written because it actually happened? That's a real possibility. In fact, people didn't have a problem with that until about 100 some years ago, where men started rejecting the Bible and its history. So, let's talk a little bit about the flood of pagans. There's an interesting tradition. Now, I'm not saying that this tradition is true, but it's so interesting, I want to share it with you. The tradition is an Assyrian tradition that states that Seth, right? Seth, the son of Adam and Eve, who lived to be, according to the Bible, 912 years old, recorded the pre-deluge, that's the pre-flood history, on burnt and unburned bricks. So those that were burned could withstand a flood, and those that were burned would withstand fire, as they would only become hardened. Now, again, I don't necessarily believe that this absolutely is true, but it's interesting. You have this tradition where what? The people of God wanted to preserve history before the flood. And they wanted that to be survived with the flood or through the flood. And so he put it on burned bricks and unburned bricks, so whether it was water or fire or whatever be involved, it would withstand. And they would have this written record of what happened in the history of mankind before the flood. Now, I don't know if that's true, right? It's an interesting tradition, but one thing we do know is that history was kept alive, and that history was recorded. Whether it was recorded on bricks, recorded by man and kept with Noah through the flood, whatever it might be, or simply preserved by God, giving inspiration to Moses to write this. But of course, many people reject that because it comes from the Bible. It's a rejection because of the content of the Bible. And so we can't have that. But I believe that this tradition states something that is a reality. And that there was, by Noah and God's people, this incredible desire to keep the history of pre-flood alive and well in the hearts of people. And we're going to see some of that in these lessons. So, what will we find? We're going to take a look at some of these flood stories. We're not going to take a look at all of them. But as we talked about last time, what are we going to find? Well, we're going to find that Yahweh is exchanged for their God or gods. Obviously, they're not going to give credit to the flood from Yahweh. They've rejected him. But in their flood story, there is a God, or there's gods, their gods, that are enacting all of this. Okay? Just keep that in mind. Number two, the stories of their mythology and the Bible are very similar, and sometimes they are the same. In fact, I'm going to highlight the times where those stories, at least some of them, are not just similar to the Bible, but are almost exactly the same. Okay? And then thirdly, as we look at these flood stories by the pagans, we're going to see that these are stories that are changed and distorted. A lot of this comes from verbal teaching, verbal storytelling. And so you're going to get a sense where some of the details get a little distorted. In fact, this is so interesting. There are stories of pre-flood, like Adam and Eve and other stories after the flood, the Tower of Babel, that enter into these flood stories. Distorted like as they were part of the story, even though they weren't. And you can imagine that that's in their mind, but they don't have it quite clear and straight. And so they attribute it to Noah and the flood, even though it was something like Eve and the devil. And so these are the things that we're going to see as we look at this, and this is what we would expect to find. They're not trying to match the Bible, but let's go ahead and get started. The oldest flood account outside of the Bible is what is known as the Babylonian flood story. Okay? So in the Babylonian flood story, here are the points in that story that match the Bible. Number one, in the Babylonian flood story, there was a warning that a flood was coming upon the earth. And I would imagine it was from one of the Babylonian gods. Number two, there was a certain man, and in the flood story, he happened to be the 10th king of Babylon, and he was commanded to build a ship to survive the flood. Now, remember, in our last lesson, lesson 3, we talked about some of those idols that they created were former leaders, rulers, and kings. And Noah was deified. And perhaps that's what's going on here. I don't know. But they've turned this man that builds a ship into one of their kings. Number 3, on this ship, he was to take food and animals, including birds. Now, they're not trying to match the Bible. This is stories that came up in their culture from their people. Number 4, the man also had his family aboard. Are you getting this? Number 5, when the floodwaters subsided, birds were sent out, but since there was no place for them to rest, they returned to the ship. This is the Babylonian flood story. Number 6, on the third attempt, birds were released from the ship. This time, they didn't return. Isn't that incredible? Do you see that? Number 7, the ship came to rest, finally, on a mountain. Number 8, the man left the ship, and as his first act upon returning to dry ground, he built an altar and offered sacrifices. Now, as you see, as I stated there, obviously these were sacrifices to the Babylonian gods. But you see the parallel, don't you? Why are these stories matching? Because it happened just that way. There was a man that built a boat, and he survived the flood, and he sent out birds, and he offered sacrifices, and they remember all of that, but it's attributed to their gods. If that didn't happen, why do we have these two stories so similar in these points? Let's talk a little more about the Babylonian flood story. Of interest, the man and his wife in this story are rewarded for their obedience and taken up to be with the gods. The surviving people are told that the mountain the ship rested on was called Armenia. Many people believe this is exactly where the ark resides today, in Armenia, under layers and layers of ice. After all these years, you got to understand, it's not just going up to a mountain and finding pieces of wood. It is buried under levels and levels of ice. Years and years of this ice building up and being so high, it apparently never melted. I don't know if we'll ever find the ark. But in those days, let's take a look at this. The legend states the ship survived many days after the flood, and people would visit it and would remove some of the wood and use it for charms. Remember we talked about in previous lesson that they not only deified people, but they deified objects. and saw what? Spiritual power and deity in objects? Well, that's exactly what's going on with these pieces of the flood. Let's talk a little bit about Josephus. In Josephus, in his Antiquities of the Jews, the Jewish historian Josephus mentions the same legend, and here it is. Here's his words. It is said there is still some part of this ship in Armenia, at the mountain of the Corinthians, and that some people carry off pieces of the bitumen, which they take away and use chiefly as amulets for the averting of mischiefs. He also references the many non-Jewish historical accounts of the flood as evidence for the authenticity of the Genesis flood story. And so Josephus knows about this legend, talks about it in his writings, and in fact is doing the same thing we're doing here, uses the multiplicity of flood stories as what? Evidence that it actually did happen. Remember, we also talked about that people formed gods, their own gods, to what? To have a sense of protection, to take away their fears of the unknown and the dangers of the world. And that's exactly what you see with this taking pieces of the ark. He says that they would what? Avert mischiefs, right? Dangers. Let's talk about two more ancient flood stories. One you probably have heard of, called the Gilgamesh epic. And the other one is actually recorded on a prism, which is called the Weld-Blundell prism. And here's their similarities to the biblical story. A man who builds a boat to save himself from a coming flood. Number two, the man loads the boat with his family and both domesticated and wild animals. Number three, the boat lands on a mountain. Number four, the man released both a dove and a raven to see if the waters had subsided. In fact, the Weld-Blundell prism includes a tapering off of lifespans after the flood, just like the Genesis account. There are also close parallels to Genesis chapter 5, the genealogy of Seth, and the Tower of Babel in chapter 11. So I want you to notice, here you have these two flood stories, and what? You see the commonalities of the biblical story, but not only that. After the time of the flood, you have these genealogies, and what? You see men going from living to 900, 800 years down to starting to 500, 300, down to like 100, 200 years. And this flood account has that same feature in it. That's incredible. Why are these pagans? Is every single point and part of the story the same? No. But that's what we would expect. But you can see the commonalities of why is there a commonality between their history and the biblical history of God's people? Could it be that's what happened? Is this not evidence for the very stories that the Bible teaches? Let's talk a little bit about a flood story from an Asian tale of the flood. Number one, in this flood story, the gods came to one of their ancestors and commanded he build a boat. So he began his construction in the forest. That's a good place, right? That's where the wood is. You can clear a space for building it. Number two, in this story, the devil talked the wife into behaving in a certain way to her husband so that the devil could sneak aboard the ship. Now, there's a lot of people that think what we have here is this evidence where, what does this sound like? This sounds a little bit like Genesis 3, doesn't it? You've got the devil trying to tempt Noah's wife, right, to get aboard the ship so that he can, thwart those plans. Well, obviously this isn't part of Genesis chapter 6, but could it be possible that they're confusing the devil and Eve with the story of the flood? I see that as quite possible. All right, the builder of the ship gathered some of all animals into his ship, with the exception of a couple huge animals which would not fit. One of these was the mammoth, and perhaps this part of the story is them explaining why some creatures did not survive and no longer are in existence. I don't know, maybe that's what's going on here. Number 4, a flood that threatened the whole world. Notice, the whole world came upon the earth, killing all that remained. Why are they including these details in their flood stories? Could it be that this is what happened? This is what they were told? Could this be evidence that they were tied into Noah's family? Just like the premise we have at the very beginning of these lessons. Let's talk about a flood story from the Pagans. I'm not even sure how to pronounce that. They have this flood story where they have a character by the name of Noah. And Noah is commanded to build a boat. Now, I don't know about you, but I think it's quite possible that that's their way of spelling Noah. Noah is going to take different derivations depending on what language we're talking about. Now, am I dogmatic about that? No, but I think it's interesting that their character is so closely in spelling to Noah. Number 2, the devil is present in the story also and tempts Noah's wife to question her husband as to what he is doing. Again, a possible confusion of the devil and Eve into the story of the flood. Number 3, when the devil learns of this, he begins to destroy at night the work that Noah completes during the day. Isn't it interesting? You got this adversary, the devil, in these stories as well. Number 4, Noah collects animals upon the boat, saving them from the flood. Sorry about the mistakes there. So, do you see the similarities of these stories? It's incredible evidence. But we're told the flood never happened. Sticking with this story, let's talk about this. These two flood stories not only connect back to the biblical story, but back to the story of Eve being tempted by the devil. And we talked about that. Keith Sisman says pagans had a dualistic concept of good and evil, where the sons of Adam and Eve are often confused with the sons of Noah. And so I could see that being a reasonable expectation that they come from this biblical, godly background. They reject it. It's still in them. But as they go on, the details, the stories kind of mesh together sometimes. So let's talk a little bit about the evolutionary atheist timeline. I hope that you can see in this lesson that we see that there's a connection between all these pagan nations and all of these different continents. They all have a flood story. And so there seems to be a connection that they all were from one family, one people at one time. But if you give in to the evolutionary timeline, that's not what you expect to see. That's not what you would expect to find. They're scattered abroad. They're evolving at different places, different populations. How would they all write about a flood story? And if that's really the timeline, could you deny that there was a flood that actually occurred? You see, the flood story and the evidence we've looked at in this lesson does not fit what we would expect from what evolutionists tell us is the origin and the evolution of man. But as you look at this, our very premise of what we believe Moses is telling us is how idolatry started after the flood. This is exactly the type of evidence you would expect. This is exactly an evidence that you're not shocked by. Because what? They all came from a single people. They all came from one family. And that was Noah. And so, here's our information. I hope that you'll keep coming back for these lessons. We're going to look at some more evidence of what they tell in their stories about their gods. And you're going to see it goes right back to God's people. It goes right back to the Bible. Even though they've rejected Yahweh, they are pagans, they are idolaters, there is still some of that Bible in their stories and in their life. We'll see you for our next lesson.